Hi everyone. Today we'll be reading an excerpt from Urbanization to Cities, 1987, by Murray Bookchin, called The Rise of Capitalism. The market society that we call capitalism, a society that tends to reduce all citizens to mere buyers and sellers, and debases all the ecologically varied social relationships produced by history to the exchange of objects called commodities, did not evolve out of the feudal era. It literally exploded into being in Europe, particularly England, during the 18th and especially 19th centuries, although it had existed in the ancient world, the Middle Ages, and with growing significance in the mixed economy of the West from the 14th century up to the 17th. It is still spreading around the world, intensively in its traditional Euro-American center and extensively in the non-European world. Its forms have varied from the largely mercantile, its earliest kind, through the industrial, its more recent 18th and 19th century forms, to the statist, corporate, and multinational forms of our own time. It has slowly penetrated from its special spheres, such as the market arenas of exchange and production of commodities in cottages and later in factories, into domestic life itself, such as the family and neighborhood. This is a fairly recent advance that can be dated most strikingly from the midpoint of the 20th century. Its invasion of neighborhoods, indeed of villages and small towns, into the recesses of domestic or familial relationships, has subverted the social bond itself and threatens to totally undermine any sense of community and ecological balance and diversity in social life. Moreover, the newly gained dominance of the capitalist market relationship over all other forms of production and consociation is a major source of what I have denoted urbanization, the explosion of the city itself into vast urban agglomerations that threaten the very integrity of city life and citizenship. What makes the market society we call capitalism unique, even by contrast to its early mercantile form, is that it is an ever-expansive, accumulative, and in this respect cancerous economic system whose law of life is to grow or die. Capitalism, in its characteristically modern and dominant form, threatens not only to undermine every natural economy, which is a Marxist term, be it small-scale agricultural, artisanship, or simple exchange relationships. It threatens to undermine every dimension of organic society, be it kinship tie, communitarian forms of association, systems of self-government, and localist allegiances, the sense of home and place. Owing to its metastatic invasion of every aspect of life by means of monetization, and what Emanuel Wallerstein calls commodification, it threatens the integrity of the natural world, soil, flora, fauna, and the complex economies that have made present-day life forms and relationships possible by turning everything natural into an inorganic, essentially synthetic form. Soil is being turned into sand. Variegated landscapes into level and simplified ones. Complex relationships into more primal forms, such that the evolutionary clock was being turned back to a biotically earlier time when life was less varied in form and its range more limited in scope. The effect of capitalism on the city has been nothing less than catastrophic. The commonly used term urban cancer can be taken literally to designate the extent to which the traditional herbs of the ancient world have been dissolved into a primal, ever-expanding and destructive form that threatens to devour city and countryside alike. Growth in the special form that singles out modern capitalism from all earlier forms of economic life, including earlier forms of capitalism itself, has affected what we persist in calling the city by leading to the expansion of pavements, streets, houses, and industrial, commercial, and retail structures over the entire landscape, just as a cancer spreads over the body and invades its deepest recesses. Cities in turn have begun to lose their form as distinctive cultural and physical entities, as humanly scaled and manageable political entities. Their functions have changed from ethnical areas with a uniquely humane civilized form of consociation, free of all blood ties and family loyalties, into immense, overbearing, and anonymous marketplaces. They were becoming centers primarily of mass production and mass consumption, including cultural as well as physically tangible objects. Indeed, culture has become objectified into commodities, as have human relationships, which are increasingly being simplified and mediated by objects. The simplification of social life in the biosphere by a growth-oriented economy is what production and consumption become ends in... What the fuck? Wait, okay. The simplification of social life in the biosphere by a growth-oriented economy in what production and consumption become ends in themselves is yielding the simplification of the human psyche itself. The strong sense of individualism that marked the people of the mixed society preceding capitalism is giving way to a receptive consumer and taxpayer, a passive observer of life rather than an active participant in it, lacking economic roots that support self-absorptiveness and community roots that foster participation in social life. Citizenship itself, conceived as a function of character formation in politics, as a part of a paideia, or education of a social being, tend to wane into personal indifference to social problems. The decline of the citizen more properly by his or her dissolution into a being lost in a mass society, the human counterpart of the mass-produced object, is furthered by the burgeoning of social gigantism that replaces the human scale, and by a growing bureaucracy that replaces all the organic sinews that held pre-capitalist society together. The counselor is the humanistic counterpart of the indifferent bureaucrat, and the counseling chamber is the structural counterpart of the governmental office. Let it be said that this debasement of the ecological complexity of the city, its policies, its citizens, and the individuals who people its streets and stretchers, is of very recent origin. It did not really begin in a manorial society with its barons and serfs, food cultivators and artisans, and all the orders we denote as feudal. Nor did it follow from those grossly misnamed revolutions, the bourgeois democratic ones of England, America, and France, that ostensibly catapulted capital into political control of a society that it presumably controlled economically during earlier periods. I'm going to read that one more time. Nor did it follow from those grossly misnamed revolutions, the bourgeois democratic ones of England, America, and France, that ostensibly catapulted capital into political control of a society it presumably controlled economically during earlier generations. Okay. Rather, this development began to appear with technical innovations that made possible both the mass manufacture of cheap commodities and, what is crucially important, their increasingly rapid transportation into the deepest recesses of Western Europe. Inexpensive and highly competitive with the products of local artisans who had serviced their localities for centuries. It need hardly be emphasized that this development depended enormously for its success on the opening of colonial markets abroad. The Americas, Africa, and particularly Asia, the area where the English crown found its richest jewel, notably India. It was the extraordinary combination of technical advances with the existence of highly technological advances with the existence of a variegated society, relatively free of the cultural constraints on trade that prevailed in antiquity, that gave economic ascendancy to the capitalist component of the mixed economy over all its other components. Neither wealth from the Americas nor the large monetary resources accumulated by port cities from long-distance trade fully explains the rise of industrial capitalism, a form of capitalism that more than any other penetrated into the very inner life of Europe. Had the wealth acquired from the New World been a decisive factor in creating industrial capitalism, Spain rather than England should have become its center, for it was Spanish conquistadors who initially plundered the Aztec and Inca empires and brought their precious metals to Europe. The very wealth these empires provided for the ascendant nation-state in Spain served to weaken town life in the Iberian Peninsula and provide the means for the absolute monarchs to embark on an archaic program of continental empire building that eventually ruined Spanish cities and the countryside alike. Nor did long-distance trade provide the most important sources for capitalizing industrial development. Rather, it fostered consumption more than production, the dissolute lifeway that makes for a diet of luxuries instead of the habits that steer investment into new means of production. Indeed, too much state centralization and too much commerce, despite the wealth they initially generated, ultimately led to excessive expenditures for territorial expansion and high living by elite groups in all orders of a courtly society. That nation building, increased centralization, or more properly, national consolidation, prepared the way for industrial capitalism by opening more hinterlands to trade is patently clear. So too did the increases in the population of dispossessed, propertyless hands, whether as a result of land enclosures or normal demographic growth, hands that were available for a factory system that had yet to appear on the economic horizon. Europe, in effect, was more open than any part of the world to the expansion of its capitalist component along industrial lines. This was especially true of England. What pushed the capitalist component of this mixed economy into a nation that could regard itself as the workshop of the world in the 19th century was a series of inventions that made the factory system and the distribution of its wares possible. I'm gonna have some water. Nice. Nor need we be concerned with whether the needs of a rising bourgeoisie produced the Industrial Revolution, or the Industrial Revolution gave rise to the bourgeoisie, which in any case was always a presence in all the major cities of Europe. Factories, in fact, had begun to appear in 18th and even 17th century England. Think Les Mis, except in England. Long before an industrial technology had emerged, whether the bourgeoisie entered into the productive sphere rather than the commercial, it tried to bring labor together and rationalize outputs even with tools. Hence, the strictly technological interpretation of the rise of industrial capitalism would be misleading. My concern here is how industrial capitalism managed to gain ascendancy over other forms of production, including commercial capitalism, and alter all social relationships that encountered its power. Water wheels had preceded the steam engine as a prime mover, and watersheds organized around simple tools. What? Water wheels had preceded the steam engine as a prime mover, and worksheds organized around simple tools had preceded mechanized factories. But without the inventions that introduced the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, it is doubtful that industrial capitalism would have impacted so powerfully on Europe and ultimately on the entire world. Within a span of some 2 generations, Europe was transformed on a scale unprecedented in the history of Western Europe. Friedrich Engels, The Condition of the Working Class in England, a period piece based on personal observations in 1844, could justly call the changes introduced by the new industrial inventions, principally in textiles, metallurgy, and transportation, a historic change of unprecedented proportion. The rapidity of the transformation is what makes these changes so startling in a domain of human endeavor. Technology, which has started over centuries at a slow, piecemeal pace. The cultural and social ramifications of this technological revolution were nothing less than monumental. Wraps it up for today.